Alright, good morning everyone. So as you can see, pretty nice weather but absolutely terrible waves this morning, so I'm not going to be able to get out a surf edit for this week, but I've had something on my mind, a little how-to video that I really wanted to bring out for you guys. I think will be really helpful. So let's get into the office and do that now. Longboarding isn't like shortboarding. With shortboarding, our feet move very little, and just naturally from the pop-up, our feet are in the right spot from the get-go. Whether we need to generate speed, pump down the line, or whether we need to throw a big turn, we can rely on just simply putting our weight forwards or backwards. With longboarding though, this isn't necessarily the case, and we do need to take a very different approach, where we'll need to actually be walking up and down the board depending on the part of the wave that we're in, or the maneuvers that we want to be doing, generating speed, turning. We do need to put ourselves in different positions on the board. And in line with this is walking the board or cross-stepping does become an extremely important aspect of longboarding, and this leads into one of the most common problems as well, which is where we get stuck in the same place on the longboard. Getting stuck, or like I like to say, getting sticky feet on the longboard, is where we get stuck in the same position and we don't have the means of moving ourselves out of this position on the board when we need to. So it might be that we're stuck in the middle of the board and we need to come backwards or come forwards depending on the part of the wave that we're on, or as we spoke about before, the maneuver that we want to complete. And so we don't have the means of either cross-stepping or repositioning ourselves up and down the board to escape this. Now, this comes off the back of a great question asked by Adam, who asked about getting stuck in the middle of the board after the first two cross steps. And so what we'll do today is we'll delve into why this happens and how we can fix it. We usually get stuck in the middle of the board where we want to venture somewhere else so that we can reposition ourselves. The middle of the board on a longboard can be a bit of a blessing and a curse. So we know, as we've spoken about previous times on this channel, the middle of the board can be really effective for gaining balance and gaining speed, but it can also be a little bit detrimental if we're coming into certain sections. These being, if the wave is steepening out, we're heading towards the flats and we're in the middle of the board, there's a pretty high likelihood we're going to nosedive. And the same thing goes for if we're heading down the line and we're coming into a closeout section that we might need to turn away from. If we're stuck in the middle of the board and we can't reposition ourselves back to the tail to turn away from the braking section, then obviously this is going to become a bit of an issue as well. So how do we solve this? Now, there's two ways I like to think about this, and we'll go through both of these nice and slowly. The first one is where we're in the middle of the board and then we need to reposition ourselves back to the tail to make sure that we can maneuver the board or create a turn, either to turn us away from a certain section, put us in a different part of the wave, or just complete a maneuver altogether. The other one is where we're moving towards the nose and we're wanting to commit to the nose for a nose ride. So let's go through both of those now. Using that first example, where we need to come back to the tail for a variety of reasons, there's two ways that I like to think about this. The first one, and the fairly obvious one, is we need to get really comfortable cross-stepping backwards. I usually find that if we get stuck in the middle of the board for a certain part of the wave, it might be that we're not confident enough to create a really committed cross-step back to the tail in order to reposition ourselves. And this might simply be because we haven't practiced the backwards cross-step very much, or we're in a part of the wave that is a little unstable, say the wave's sucking up and it's quite critical and we need to come back to the tail, but we don't yet quite have the confidence or the competence to do that yet. So there's a few things that we need to do here. Firstly, the land practice of the cross step back can be really useful, and I know I tend to come back to this a fair bit within the videos, but it is really good. If you're practicing something out in the water, firstly, repetition's pretty hard to come by because every wave's a little bit different, and then it's also really tricky because we're not practicing it in the most, conducive environment to both repetition, and also it's not a very easy environment to learn in. So what we want to do is practice it on land first. Get your positioning, even film yourself like I have here, cross-stepping backwards, and just make sure that everything looks good. So we're committing our weight backwards. You can see the position of your chest, your knees, making sure everything's low. That's going to be super important first. What we can then do is try and practice that cross step in an easier section. So if you're struggling cross-stepping backwards when you're coming to the flats in a critical section and you want to practice that, it might be best firstly to practice it in a really nice section. So a slower part of the wave out on the shoulder where you can have a little bit more room for error. There's not as much speed on the wave and there's not as much wobble, so you'll be able to get this a little better. We need to make sure we get plenty of repetition in for this. When we feel like we're getting more and more confident with this, we can start to transition it into these more critical sections so that we can come from the middle of the board to the tail when we need to. But the big thing at this stage is, even if we've been practicing it lots, bringing this into a new section or a new critical section will be pretty tricky. And from here, it is about commitment and making sure we're committed to the cross step backwards. Being stuck in itself is a symptom of hesitation. So if we're going to hesitate through this, we're likely to not commit that backwards cross step properly. So you really do need to make sure you commit, give yourself the permission to fall. And that's why, again, trying it in easier waves, maybe from your less critical sections to your critical sections on smaller waves, and then to the bigger waves, can be a good way to move past this. Now, the next thing I would say, if we're not quite at the cross step backwards yet, and we do need to find ourselves back to the tail, is trying to do a little bit of a repositioning where we separate our stance, so bringing that back foot further back, getting low and really in a nice stable, low balanced position, and then bringing our front foot back as well. So it's nice and stable and nice and balanced, but this is just an interim thing that we can do, that we can learn to bring ourselves to the tail. Of course, the cross step is preferred just within our, I guess, progressions of longboarding. This is a really important thing to consider and a really important thing to get right. But if we are not at that stage just yet, let's try that back foot coming back, stay low, bring the front foot back, and then we can commit our turn backwards. So a little bit of a shuffle there. That's the first step of how we become unstuck from that middle of the board to the tail. But what about this middle of the board to the nose? Now, I wanted to really hone into one of the most common problems that I see here. And quite typically, if we've done 2 steps towards the nose and we're thinking we're in the middle of the board, it might be that we're actually a little closer to the nose than you think. And this is what actually creates our problem. I think about 7, 8 times out of 10, this is actually what's happening. So have a listen and see if this applies to you. So if you're all thinking about your cross step starting from the tail, quite often it's within that back third. Instead of coming straight from the tail to the middle, that cross step's actually more likely to bring us from the back third of the board to the front third of the board, or a little bit past that halfway point on the surfboard. Now, what happens here and why we get stuck is we've actually not got a very far distance to make those next 2 cross steps happen to the nose. And so we get a little bit hesitant and apprehensive because we're coming into the most critical part of the wave, which is the most off balance. And then we're also coming into the most off balance part of the board, this being the, front 2 feet of the board. So inherently, this is going to be really difficult. This is going to be really tricky to fit those steps in. What we need to do to help this and to assist ourselves with being able to move from this position and not getting stuck from this point of after the first 2 cross steps so that we can take those next 2 is actually making sure we know where we're landing after the first 2 cross steps. So again, this would be great to practice on land, but even if you can get some footage of yourself when you're surfing in the water, this is going to be really helpful as well to help either confirm or deny whether you're actually landing in the middle or a little bit too far forwards. Again, if we're too far forwards, we're going to see there's very little space for us to take those next 2 cross steps, and this is likely the reason we're actually getting stuck. So what we want to do is make sure the starting position is where we want to be, say on the tail or at least in that back third of the board. And what we might end up doing is correcting the spacing of our cross-stepping so that our front foot lands right in the middle of the board. Now, this is going to be really important, actually help us to stabilize. If you think about that step and reset method that we spoke about on the Sunday glide a little while back, we can actually step through, make sure we're not too far forwards on the board, and then bring our chest over front foot, balance, stabilize, and then we can consider going forwards a little bit further with our cross steps. And this is really, really going to help because we can take a larger step going into the nose, which is going to help for increasing our base of support, increasing our stability. And also that back foot can land a bit further back from the nose as well, which is always going to be important for making sure that we don't have our feet always too close to the nose, or our back foot especially. If a lot of our pressure's on that back foot and it's closer to the front of the board, then obviously we're more likely to nosedive. If it's further back, we've got a little bit more leeway in stopping ourselves from nosediving or decreasing the likelihood we're going to nosedive, especially in a section that's not super, super critical. So they're the 2 methods that I really, really like to use, whether it be coming from the middle of the board to the tail or vice versa to the front of the board. I hope you can use both of those to make sure that we get more confident and fluent in crossing ourselves from one part of the board to another. So if you can give that a go, I'd love to hear how it's going, and maybe let us know in the comments below which one affected you and which one you're able to find some improvement in. This is a really common problem for a lot of people, and so if we stick at trying to improve it in these ways, it won't happen instantly, but we can see some really good improvements if we make sure we're identifying the problem correctly and then we're targeting in this way. We see some really good results. If you do have any further questions as well, or if you're a little bit confused as to why you're getting stuck in the middle, or if there's something I haven't covered today that is making you feel a little bit stuck and you can't shift your position on the board, leave that in the comments below as well, and I'd be happy to get to that. If you like what we're doing here, please feel free to subscribe. Hope everyone's getting waves, and we'll catch you on the next one.